All right, Rabbi, good morning. It is an incredible zechus to be able to be here and to learn with all of you today. Baruch Hashem, so wonderful to see the Chevra and the Shul, and the great zechus to be giving the daf from Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, which is, I don't think you can see out my back window over here, but Baruch Hashem, it's a white Yerushalayim, a beautiful snowfall overnight. Fascinating to see, Baruch Hashem, the dynamic of the holy city with some sheleg. So I will say it is an incredible schos to be able to learn with you today. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors. I just had it here. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. Bracha Strimber for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kálman, Eliazer Halevi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Baruch Meir and Rena Dubin, for dedicating all of the shiurim this week in the merit of a refuah sheleima for Chava Tzipporah bas Chaya Malka. And Abose, with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Tes Vav 15. And we are picking up in Merit Hashem on Yud Dalid Amud Beis Mitzora. So we are picking up, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. So asks the Gemara as follows. And Chaver, so wonderful to be here with all of you. Baruch Hashem. One of the incredible things about technology gives us the opportunity to be together even if we're separated by thousands of miles of space. And it's wonderful to see the Chaver on Zoom. Wonderful to see the Chaver in the Shul in the Beis Medrash. Truly, truly beautiful. So the Gemara says as follows: Mitzora mahu shiyanik tzarasa b'regam. So the Gemara asks the following shaila: Does the Mitzora conduct himself in accordance with the laws of tzaraas on Yom Tiv? So Amar Abaye says Tashma v'hanazir v'amitzora mitumasol taraso. So remember again, the Abaye said that ultimately, again, the Mishnah explained that the Nazir and Mitzora. Remember again, when the Mishnah was talking about who's permitted to engage in hair cutting, so the Mishnah spoke about the Mitzora or a Nazir who finished their Tzara'as duration or who finished their Nazirite duration have the ability to cut their hair. So the Pashtos, that sounds like the Gemara says, Habi mei tumaso nog. So the Gemara says, tumaso taraso, Habi mei tumaso nog, lomi bai kamar, lomi bai mei tumaso delo nog, aval taras nigzas. So let me go back to this in just a moment. So the Mishnah itself said that halacha l'maisa, that a nazir and a mitzora have the ability to go ahead and cut their hair. So if the Nazirite vow ends, or ultimately the tzara'as ends, so they have the ability to go ahead and cut their hair on Chol Hamoed. So the Gemara says like this: mitum asul taraso. So if ultimately, again, the Mishnah is talking about a case where we're going from Tumah to Tara, Habi mei tumaso nog, certainly, again, that must mean that the Tumah stipulations or the Tumah aspects of the Mitzora certainly go ahead and apply on Chol Hamoed, to which the Gemara says not necessarily, Lomi bai kamar, Lomi bai mei tumaso delo nohig. It could be that maybe what the Mishnah is saying is like this: maybe me'ikar adin, the Mitzora does not conduct himself in accordance with the halachos of his tumah on Chol Hamoed. Aval taraso nigzar shemayasha kabanasa. But perhaps you might have thought that maybe we don't let the Mitzora become tahar, go through a purification process on Chol Hamoed. Now, why would you have such a havamina like that? Because at the end of the day, perhaps we should be concerned that halacha l'maisa, he will not appropriately bring his karbanos for his tara. Part of the process of the tara for the Mitzora is bringing karbanos. Perhaps we should be concerned that halacha l'maisa is going to delay the offering of his karbanos, and therefore perhaps we shouldn't even allow him to engage in the tara process on Chol Hamoed. Kamashal, that's not the case. Now, both say, now why would we be concerned that he's going to go ahead and delay his tara? If you look at Rashi says over here, Nigzar, Shelo Yehi Megalech B'Moed, the Kevan the Gilach Tzarech Lahavi Karban, Shema Masha Karbonosav Ad Yom Tov Ha'acharon Umakrivan, Vasal Hakriv Karbonos Yachid Miyom Tov. What we're concerned about is like this: if the Mitzora were to undergo his Tara process, then on Chol Hamoed, then perhaps what we could be concerned about is he will delay bringing his karbanos until sometime later on. When we say later on, what we mean is second days of Yom Tiv. The problem with the 2nd days of Yom Tov is you can't bring a karban yachid. You can't go ahead and bring a personal offering on Yom Tov itself, and that would cause him to go ahead and have to delay effectively until after Yom Tov. So therefore, you might have thought that halacha l'maaseh, therefore, we should not allow him to engage in his Torah process on Chol Hamoed. Kamash malan, that's not the case. Good. So what's the Gemara goes weiter? Amar Rava Toshma, 4 lines up from the bottom. Vatzarua, the Rabbos Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara says, so we're still not clear. Remember, we're starting with a simple fundamental shaila, which is that does the Metzora conduct himself in accordance with his tzara'as strictures on Yom Tiv or not? So the Gemara tries to prove this from a different place. Vahatzarua, the person who is stricken with tzara'as, the Rabbos Kohen Gadol. This comes to include a Kohen Gadol, that even a Kohen Gadol is subject to the halachos of tzara'as. Says the Gemara, this is very interesting. Vaha Kohen Gadol d'chol hashana keregel l'cholei alma dami. Everyone listen to this. The Kohen Gadol throughout the year has the same status as regular people have over Yom Tiv. But say what a statement. The Kohen Gadol has the same status throughout the year as a regular Jew has on Yom Tiv. How so? This nan Kohen Gadol makriv onein. A Kohen Gadol offers up his karbanos even when he is a state of aninos, ve'eno ochel, but he does not go ahead and eat of them. So we'll say, what does that mean? That a Kohen essentially does not have a status of aninos. So too a regular person on Chol Hamoed, also on Yom Tiv, also doesn't have a status of aninos. So the Gemara says something amazing. The status of a Kohen Gadol throughout the year is the equivalent to the status of a regular person on Yom Tiv. What do we see from here? Shmamina nohek tsar aso beregel. In Rabbosai, we also said that a Kohen Gadol ultimately again can become a Metzora. So the fact that a Kohen Gadol can become a Metzora and a Kohen Gadol status throughout the year is like a regular person on Yom Tiv. So you see from here that the strictures of tzara'as apply on Yom Tiv, shmamina. And Rabbosai, that is indeed the halacha. That the Metzora, with all of his strictures, those halachos, those strictures of tzara'as apply to the Metzora on Yom Tiv. So Rabbosai also just gives you an insight into the Kedusha of the Kohen Gadol. What a statement. That the Kedusha of the Kohen Gadol is the Kedusha of the Kohen Gadol throughout the year is the equivalent of the Kedusha of an individual on Yom Tiv. Or effectively, the Kohen Gadol's entire life is one big regel. His entire life is one Yom Tiv. Rabbi said, what is it about the Kohen Gadol that allows his life to be a Yom Tiv? Because the Kohen Gadol lives his life lifnei Hashem. The Kohen Gadol lives his life in the immediate proximity of the Ribono Shel Olam. And what it tells you is something amazing. That when a person, have to be the Kohen Gadol, when a person decides to live his life in a state of Lifnei Hashem, in a state of constantly being before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a state of constant God awareness, then every single day becomes like a regel. Every day becomes like a Yom Tiv. Every day, every individual has the ability to be a Kohen Gadol if he decides to live his life lifnei Hashem. Such an incredible Gemara. Go say the Gemara goes weiter. Avel aser b'tisporas. On Avel, so now we're going to get into, for the remainder of this daf, we're actually going to be focused on the halachos of Avelus. It was a really incredible sugis. Avel aser b'tisporas, and Avel is not permitted to cut his hair. And Abba said, whenever we speak about tisporas means cutting your hair or shaving. But say after the death of Nadav and Abihu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Aaron, to Elazar, and to Itamar, do not cut your hair. Right? Or excuse me, I should say, do not allow your hair to grow long. That's what he was saying to them. Do not allow your hair to grow long. Michlal dekuli alma aser. The fact that Hashem says to Aaron and Aaron's 2 remaining sons, Al tifro gidul seir, Rashi says, do not allow your hair to grow long, indicates to us that under normal circumstances of Avelus, an Avel is not permitted to cut his hair. Nabo said this is indeed halacha l'maisa. Almost all of the halachos of Avelus we're going to learn out from the next blot of Maseches Moed Katan. So it says the Gemara, top of Tesvav, top of 15a, Menuda and Metzora and Mahir B'Tispara. So we'll say, what about a Menuda and a Metzora? So remember again, Menuda is someone who is excommunicated, although we'll see in tomorrow's daf that there are different levels of excommunication, right? There's a nidui, more intense is a cherem, less intense is nezifa. We'll see all of this. What about a menuda and a metzora? Mahi bitisboris, are they permitted to cut their hair? So Tashma, we learned menudin and metzora in Asur l'saper u'lechabes. So a person who is menuda or a person who is a metzora is not permitted to go ahead l'saper, to take a haircut, u'lechabes, to launder his clothing. Furthermore, so that's pretty explicit. You see clearly that halacha l'maisa, both a menuda, well, we'll see, a menuda so far we know is not permitted to cut his hair as well. The Gemara says furthermore, says menudin and mitzorain are not permitted to cut their hair. So both say, so far we know an avel is not permitted to cut his hair. That's learned out biblically from Aaron and his sons, and a menuda and a mitzora are not permitted to cut their hair as well. The Gemara continues talking about the menuda. Menuda shemes, if a menuda dies, based in Soklan as Arono, so we'll say literally what this means is as follows. If a person dies while in a state of excommunication, so in this situation over here, the person was excommunicated, put in nidui, and never had that nidui revoked before his death. In such a situation, the Gemara says, Soklin Asarona, which literally means we stone his casket. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? I'm Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo sheya'amidu alav galavanim ki galo shel achan. It doesn't mean that we put a pile of stones on top of his casket like Achan. Achan was the individual who violated the cherem of Yericho. When Klal Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael under the leadership of Yoshua, they were told that they were not permitted to partake of the spoils of Yericho. While Achan went ahead and partook, and as a result he was killed and he was buried underneath a pile of stones. So the Gemara says, don't think that for the menuda we put his casket under a pile of stones. Ela beis din sholchin umanichin even gedola ala rono. Rather, what happens? Beis din comes along and they place one large stone on top of his casket. Lalamdecha, to teach us, shekol hamisnade umeis b'niduyav, anyone who's excommunicated and dies while in the state of excommunication, Beis Din Soklin es Arono. Beis Din goes ahead and literally stones his casket, which again means Beis Din places this large stone on top of his casket as a sign of his excommunication. Which is such an incredible yisod. You would think that when a person dies, that their excommunication is over. You see that sometimes the baggage of our negative activity follows us into the afterlife as well, right? The baggage of our negative activity often does not end when our lives end here in this world, but continue along with us. That is why it is so important that if there is baggage, and if there are things that have to be rectified, and there are things that have to be fixed, not to wait, but to do it now. Because if we don't, then chas v'shalom, when we leave this world, we can be saddled with that negativity for eternity. So the Gemara goes weiter. Avel chayiv bativas harosh. On Avel is chayiv to wrap his head. Now, both saying this is no longer something that is currently practiced, although it is codified in halacha. But quite literally, again, the Avel would take, like if you could imagine, like a shawl or like a talis, and he would wrap his head. He would put it around his head. We're going to see he would really wrap his face as well, not his whole face, but really by his mouth. That's called atifas harosh. So we're going to see now many of the halachos that we have are from the Navi Yechezkel. But specifically, there's an episode in Yechezkel where HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yechezkel that that Yechezkel's wife is going to die. But he tells Yechezkel that he's obligated to abstain from certain mourning practices. So interestingly enough, what the Gemara uses is, from that which Yechezkel is told to abstain, we learn what are the positive obligations of mourning. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Yechezkel, "V'lo sata al safam," tells Yechezkel, do not cover your mouth. Michlal dekuli alma mechaybe. You see from here that generally a person is obligated to cover their head, to cover their face, from the fact that Yechezkel was told, don't cover your face. Okay, so the Gemara says, menuda malbati vasarosh, but is the menuda, the person who's excommunicated, is he also obligated to cover his head, right, to wrap his head? Rav Yosef Tashma, vehin misatfin v'yoshvin kemenudin uke'avelin ad shirachamu aleim min hashamayim. So both say, this is from Maseches Tainis. And interestingly enough, remember again, the Mishnah Maseches Tainis speaks about the fast days, and specifically speaks about the after they went ahead and they fasted the 13 fast days. The 13 fast days. And there was still no rain. What would happen? The Talmidei Chachamim would sit, they would be wrapped, and they would sit like menudin, people have been excommunicated, and like mourners. Until HaKadosh Baruch would have compassion upon them. So the idea being, you see from here, that a menuda, someone who is excommunicated, does wrap his head. Abai says that's not a good raya. Dilma menuda l'shamayim shiny dechamer. Ultimately, again, we'll say maybe someone who's excommunicated by heaven, right? Because remembering by Shamayim, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the lack of rain is considered to be in the eyes of Chazal as someone who's been excommunicated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Maybe such a person has to wrap himself, but perhaps a person who's quote-unquote only excommunicated by an earthly court would not be obligated to wrap themselves. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Mitzora mal ba'atifas harosh. What about a Mitzora? Is he obligated to wrap his head? Tashma va'al safam ya'ateh. So the pasuk says that ultimately, again, the Mitzora is obligated to cover himself until his lips. Right, to cover himself until his lips. So you see also that the Mitzora is chayiv in atifas harosh, is chayiv to go ahead and wrap his head. Michlal shechay b'atifas harosh shmamina. So if Rabbi comes out is an Aval is obligated in atifas harosh in wrapping his head. A Mitzora is obligated in atifas harosh. The menuda, it's unclear whether or not he's obligated. Now both say, so again, because just our clothing has changed styles, so we don't have this din of atifas harosh contemporarily by Avelos. Mar goes weiter. Avel asar le'aniach tefillin. An Avel is prohibited to put on tefillin. Midikamarli rachmanali yecheskel pe'ercha chavu shalecha. From the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yecheskel, literally again, allow your glory to remain upon you. So we'll say the ideal here is the glory, the fe'er, right? The fe'er is tefillin. So the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yecheskel to continue to wear his tefillin indicates to us that under normal circumstances, an Avel doesn't wear tefillin. Michlad d'choli alma aser. So in general, again, the fact that Yecheskel is told to do it indicates to us that under normal circumstances, an Avel would not wear tefillin. So I just want to point out with this halacha by Avelos, this really is Avelos of the first day, that an Avel doesn't wear tefillin, which for us is really the status of aninos. Right, so when a person is an onen, they don't put on tefillin. And again, halacha lamaisa, the first, which often becomes the first day of Avelos as well. So the Gemara goes right to the Gemara says menuda mal b'tefillin. Just I'll point out, not for now, a lot of very interesting discussions about whether or not an Avel is permitted to put on tefillin. There's an exemption. But from the Gemara, it sounds like over here that it is an Isser. So again, a lot of interesting halachic discussion about the license to put on tefillin. In any event, we'll go with the Gemara's simple reading that an Avel does not put on tefillin on the first day. What about menuda mal b'tefillin? Does a menuda, a person who's excommunicated, does he put on tefillin? So teku, the Gemara leaves it as a kasha. Mitzora mal b'tefillin. Does a mitzora put on tefillin? So tashma v'hat sarua l'rabos kohen gadol. Pasuk says v'hat sarua, the person who becomes a mitzora, to come to include that even a kohen gadol could become a mitzora. That his clothing has to be torn, right? The Mitzora has to tear his clothing, he tears kriya. The Rosho Yepro, say first wide line, and his head is parua. What does parua mean? Ein priya ela gidul seir divrei Rabbi Eliezer. And priya ultimately means that the Mitzora ultimately goes ahead and allows his hair to grow. Rabbi Akiva says, Ne'emar havia berosh ve'ne'emar havia bebeged. Rabbi Osai uses the lashon of yihiyah, ultimately again by his head, and yihiyah by his clothing. Mahavia amura bebeged davar shechutz migufo. Just like havia by a beged means something external to his body. Ultimately, his clothing shall be turned. His clothing is external to him. So to af havia berosh davar shechutz migufo. So to again, when it's referring to his head, it's referring to something external to the head as well. What's external to the head? My lava tefillin. Does it not refer ultimately again to his tefillin and telling us that what? That ultimately again sounds like that a Mitzora would not wear tefillin as well. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Amar Apabalo akumsa v'sudra. Maybe not. Maybe that's not referring to tefillin, but ultimately again, maybe it's referring to his hat or his turban. And it's saying that Allah Lamaisa, he shouldn't wear his hat or his turban, but he can wear tefillin. So ultimately, going to both say over here, interestingly enough, so we're clear that an Avel does not put on tefillin. That's clear. Ultimately, Menuda was a teku, and Mitzora also seems to be unclear as well. The Gemara goes weiter. Avel aser b'sheila shalom. On Avel is not permitted to extend a greeting. Now, both say, now, interestingly enough, just so you understand the greeting here in this context, the greeting often refers to a greeting b'shem Hashem, like Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem. B'pashtos, it does not really apply to hello, good morning, things like that, which are more sure. So she'ela shalom literally means a formal greeting, which includes the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So an Avel is aser b'she'ela shalom t'kam l'rachman l'Yecheskel ha'anek dom. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Yecheskel ha'anek dom, which means grieve silently. Grieve silently. So it's telling him to be silent. So again, he's telling him to grieve silently. From here you see that Allah Lamaisa and Avel is aser b'she'ilas shalom. Incredible. So we'll say, so if you take a look, so I'll say, I point out, up until now, we've been learning out from Yecheskel, when Hashem says to Yecheskel, do something, that means that a normal Avel is not permitted to do it. Here the example, interestingly enough, is Hashem is telling Yecheskel, ha'anik dom, grieve silently, and just as Yecheskel was not permitted to greet anyone else, so too a person in Avelos is not permitted to greet anyone else as well. Incredible. Ma menuda ma b'sheila shalom. What about a menuda? Right? Is he permitted to greet someone? Am Rav Yosef tashma u b'sheilas shalom shebein adam lechavero ki b'nei adam hanezufin lamakom. Shabbos says, remember again, we're quoting the same brisa that we quoted before from Maseches Tainis, that if the tefillas for rain go unanswered, so ultimately the Talmidei Chachamim have to go ahead and sit like people who are excommunicated from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what do? They refrain from greeting each other. So this sounds like a person who is in a state of excommunication, ultimately is not permitted to greet someone else. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi says, not a raya. Maybe a menuda l'shamayim, someone who's excommunicated from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, maybe that's more chamer than a person who just has a nidui or an excommunication from a human court. Therefore, there's no raya, there's no proof about whether or not a menuda is aser b'she'ilas shalom. Beautiful. Mitzora ma b'she'ilas shalom. But what about mitzora? Is the mitzora permitted to greet people with the name of Hashem? Tashma bi'al safam ya'ateh. Right? Ultimately, again, as the pasuk says, he shall veil himself until his lips. Shiusif sosav medubakos zubezu, that the lips of a metzora should be sealed. She'ehei kimenuda uke'avel. He should be ultimately, again, like a menuda, like someone who's excommunicated, and like an avel. So both say, from this last line, it sounds like halacha l'maisa, the avel, the metzora, and the menuda are all aser b'she'ilas shalom, are all aser to go ahead and come and greet other people. But say it's also very profound. Remember, the lashon over here by the mitzora is the mitzora she'sif sosav midubakos zubezu. His lips should be sealed against each other. The boss say it's incredible. We know, how does a person become a mitzora? How does a person contract saras? So the truth is there are a variety of different ways, but primary amongst them is ultimately what? Is lashon hara. Is lashon hara. So the boss say, how incredible is it that sometimes a person gets themselves into trouble with lashon hara? So we think that often the way to remedy lashon hara is just don't speak lashon hara. And what the Gemara is saying is that no, sometimes the way to remedy lashon hara is shehei sifsosav midubakos zu bezu. The way to remedy lashon hara is sometimes not to simply abstain from lashon hara, but rather it's what? Abstain from speaking. I realize now when I say what, I can't expect anyone to hear anyone say anything. I trained myself for that. Let's say, so ultimately, again, right, think about this just a moment, that the way to remedy lashon hara, sheisif sosav midubakos zu bezu, don't talk. Doesn't mean don't talk ever. But it means think before I talk. It means go ahead and maybe not everything is worth saying. It's an incredible yisod. The remedy to lashon hara is not simply to abstain from speaking slanderous or negative speech. That's obvious. But the remedy for the mitzora is shehei sifsosav midubakos zu bezu. I have to train myself not always to say something, not always to talk. Not every situation requires a commentary. Not every statement requires a response. Sometimes the way we reach the greatest levels of Kedusha is to abstain from commenting, even in a non-Lashon Haradik way. But just because sometimes certain things in life are not worth saying, that's the kapara of the Mitzorah. Sheisif sosav midubako zubezu. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. The Gemara says, good. So I'll say ultimately, says the Gemara, like I just said before. So why not learn out from here? The Brisa seems to indicate that also a menuda is asar b'sheila shalom. Rav Yosef mikatani she'aser sheyehei kemenuda uke'avel ubemili achranaisa. But like all it says is that it doesn't say that it's aser, right? It doesn't say that the menuda is aser. Rather, it says that he should be like the menuda and the avel, but maybe it's referring to other things, not necessarily she'elas shalom. So the Gemara says, "Va'asernai b'she'elas shalom." Avel asar b'divrei Torah. When the Gemara goes weiter, an avel is not permitted to learn Torah. Midikam rachman ali cheskel dom. I will say, so the fact that the Torah says to the avel dom, be silent. So I will say this is actually pretty incredible. So here the Gemara understands that dom means be silent from divrei Torah. So from here you see that an avel is not permitted to learn Torah. And I will say now to qualify this for just a moment, that Allah said an avel is permitted to learn Torah when it comes to things that are related to avelos. So for example, an avel could learn Maseches Moed Katan Daf Tesvav. That's not a problem because these are the halachos of avelos. An avel is permitted to learn anything that is related to avelos or related to mourning in nature. But nevertheless, there is an Isser Talmud Torah, we call it. Menuda ma'al b'divrei Torah. What about a menuda? Is a menuda permitted to learn Torah? Amar Avi Yosef Tashma menuda shona v'shonin lo. A menuda is permitted to learn, and ultimately we could teach him. Niskar v'niskaran lo. He could hire himself out to work, and he could be hired by others. Or I should say, he could hire and be hired by others, right? Muchram, but so what about a person in Cherem? Now I mentioned this before. Cherem, as we're going to see, is a step higher than Nidui, right? They both translate as excommunication, but there are different strictures related to each of them. So Muchram, lo shona v'lo shona lo, a Muchram, he's not permitted to learn, nor is anyone else permitted to teach him. Lo niskar v'lo niskaran lo. Ultimately, again, he cannot go ahead. He cannot go ahead and Muchram lo shona v'lo shona lo, lo niskar v'lo niskaran lo. He cannot hire workers, nor could he be hired out by someone else. Aval shona hu liatzmo. But let's listen to this. The Muchram, the person in Cherem, he is permitted to go ahead and learn on his own. Shona hu. All right, so as I was saying, so the Gemara says, so the person who is in a state, ultimately again, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Muchram, right? So the Muchram ultimately again, shone huliatzmo shelo yafsik es limudo. The Muchram ultimately again is permitted to go ahead and learn a little bit on his own, in order that shelo yafsik es limudo, in order that his learning continue on. Okay. All right. So as we're saying, the Muchram, the muhram, who is the person who is in chayrim, shonahu liatzmo, he is permitted to go ahead and learn on his own. He is permitted to go ahead and learn on his own. Shelo yafsik es limudo, in order that halacha lamaisa he should not stop his learning. Va'osalo chanus kitana b'shel parnasaso, he can make a small store ultimately for his parnasa. Va'amar Rav Zavuni mai bepiska da'arvos, and Rav said that halacha lamaisa, what could he do? He could literally, again, interestingly enough, what is he allowed to sell? He could sell water, bepiska da'arvos, literally again in the outskirts. Rashi says over here, piska b'shuk shel osamakom, in the shuk of Arvos. Okay, that's the Gemara says. Shema mina. Supposed to see from there that an aval is permitted to go ahead and, an aval is prohibited to learn Torah, but a menuda ultimately again is permitted to learn, and even the muhram is permitted to go ahead and learn by himself in order to go ahead and keep up his learning. Mitzorah, ma'abed Torah. What about the mitzorah? Is the mitzorah permitted to go ahead and learn Torah? So the Gemara says, Tashma bal datin levanecha v'livnei vanecha yom asher amanata lefnei Hashem elokecha b'chorev. So the pasuk says, you shall instruct your children and your children's children about the day that you stood before HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Har Sinai. Just like Kabbalas Torah took place in a state of reverence, Mikan Amru, so too again Torah itself has to be an experience that always takes place in a state of reverence. Mikan Amru, Hazavin Bahamitzora'un U'Ba'olei Midos, Mutaron Likros Batorah Benavim Miksuvim, Ulishnos B'Medrash B'Shasu Ba'alachos Ba'agadus. From here we said something very important, that ultimately again, Zavin Mitzora'un, Ba'olei Midos, all of these individuals who are Tameh ultimately have the ability to continue to learn Torah. However, Balei Kerion Asurin. But ultimately, again, a Balkari. Now, Balkari is a person who has a seminal emission. That's the result. Rashi says, Lefi Shebala Machmas Simcha V'Kalus Rosh. A person who has a seminal emission is not in a state of Ema and Yira, and therefore, Halacha L'Maisa, they're Asr B'Divrei Torah. Again, we spoke about this a little bit in the earlier Masechtas about Takvanas Ezra. Shema Mina. So we'll say, so from here you see that Halacha L'Maisa, Mitzorah is permitted to learn Torah. So we see that an Avel is not permitted to learn Torah, a Manuda is permitted to learn Torah, and ultimately, again, a Mitzorah is permitted to learn Torah as well. Avel Asr B'Techboses. An Avel is not permitted to launder his clothing. Dichsiv, Vayishlach Yoav Tekoa, Vayikach Misham Isha Chachama, Vayomer Elahis Ablina, Veliv Shina, Bignai Al Tasochi, Veliv Shina, Big Day Avel, Al Tasochi Shemen, Vayisa Ki Isha Zeh Yamim Rab Nisabelas Ames. So I'll say the background over here is that this is Yoav, after David HaMelech expels Avshalom, so Yoav tries to, Amnon, Yoav tries to go ahead and make shalom between father and son. And the way he does that is by going ahead and getting a woman to dress up or to play the part of someone who has gone ahead and is in Avelos. So the Gemara says, so you see from here that he tells her, Liv Shina Big Day Avel. Wear clothing of Avelos. So what's the clothing of Avelos? So the Gemara is understanding it to mean unlaundered clothing. Menudin and Mitzoran Mayim B'Tachbo says, what about Menudin and Mitzoran? Are they permitted to launder clothing? So Tashma, Menudin and Mitzoran Asrun L'Saper Ulechabe Shmamina. We'll say pretty explicit. The Menudin and the Mitzorah, they are not permitted to go ahead and launder their clothing. Aval chayiv b'kriya, an aval is chayiv to tear his clothing. The common rachmana lebnei Aaron lo sifromu. So we'll say that since Kadosh Baruch Hu has to tell Aaron and his sons after the death of Nadav and Avihu, don't tear your clothing, indicates to us ultimately again that everyone else is chayiv in kriya. So the Gemara says menuda ma'al b'kriya. What about a menuda? Is he chayiv in kriya? So teku. Ultimately again the Gemara says teku. Mitzorah ma'al b'kriya. What about a mitzorah? So tashma begadav yu perumim. His clothing ultimately again should be perumim. What does perumim mean? Sheyu mikura'im. They should be torn. Shmamina. So we'll say ultimately again, you see from here that the mitzorah is chayiv in kriya as well. Aval chayiv b'kfiyas hamita. An aval is chayiv in the overturning of his bed, which we'll say literally means again, like it sounds, turning over of the bed. The turning bar kafra amud beis. Demus dikyoni nasati bahem ubava anoseim hafachtia. Kafu mitosein aleh. So we'll say the Gemara over here quotes Bar Kafra. Bar Kafra says that literally I have given my image. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying, I've created man in my image, and in their iniquities, in their sinful behavior, hafachtiha, I've had to turn them over. So therefore, kafu mitosein aleha. Therefore, go ahead and turn over the beds as well. So we'll say this is the concept ultimately of kfiyas hamita. Now this is very interesting. The Gemara says, menuda mitzora mahim b'kfiyas hamita. What about the menuda and mitzora? Do they have to go ahead and overturn their beds? To which the Gemara says, teku, that's a kasha. That's a kasha. The Gemara leaves it unresolved. But we'll say, interestingly enough, we don't do kfiyas hamita today anymore. We don't overturn our beds. So, the Aruch HaShulchan, which Mishnah Berurah quotes it as well, quotes a whole idea that there's a concern that it looks like kishuf. I don't know why this is, but for some reason over the years, so our Gentile neighbors took this to be a witchcraft, a sorcery type process, and therefore we stopped overturning the beds. The Gesher HaChaim writes something very simpler, much simpler. Gesher HaChaim says, what was the whole idea of kfiyas hamita? The idea of kfiyas hamita was as follows. It used to be that very often mattresses were made of straw. When you sleep in straw for a long enough amount of time, it takes on the form of the body. It takes on the form of the body. I guess they make mattresses like this today. What are they called? Like Tempur-Pedic or whatever it is. So they had it. This was a Talmudic Tempur-Pedic, right? So went ahead and it took the form of your body. So interestingly enough, death is considered to be the erasure of the human form. Kfiyas hamita was the overturning of the bed because essentially you obliterated the form. So today that Gesher HaChaim says we don't have these type of mattresses, therefore again there's no din of kfiyas hamita. So whether again it's because of kishuf, if people thought it was sorcery, or because again just the ikar siba, reason doesn't apply, we don't do this today. Good. Aval asr b'asiyas malacha. A novel is not permitted to do malacha. D'chsiv v'hafachti chagechem le'evel. I will turn literally again your Yom Tiv to mourning. Ma'chag asr b'malacha, just like a Yom Tiv is asr b'malacha, af avel asr b'malacha. So to an avel is asr b'malacha. So avel can't do malacha. And of course, we know that in Hilchos Abelus, what this means is an avel is not supposed to do work. There's not an isser malacha literally like Yom Tiv. In other words, I could turn on a light. I don't have to worry about cooking things. But the idea is that work, an avel doesn't do work. An avel doesn't do work. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, menuda ma'u ba'asiyas malacha. What about a menuda? Is a menuda permitted to go ahead and do malacha? So Amar Rav Yosef Tashma, kisha amru asr ba'asiyas malacha, lo amru ela bayom. Furthermore, when they said that there's an Isra Malacha, now I'll say once again, this is actually talking about Meseches Tainis. This is talking about, again, when they got to the very severe situation where there was no rainfall, and therefore there was an Isra Malacha. Kisha Amru Asra Ba'asiyas Malacha, when they said there's an Isra Malacha, Lo Amru Ela Bayom, they only said it by day. Ava Balayla Mutter, V'chein Ata Motze B'menuda U'ba'avel. And so too you'll find by Menuda and by Avel. My love akulhu. So does this not apply the halachos to all of these situations? Lo asha'ara. No, it only applies to certain ones. Tashma. So I'll say Menuda, shonin v'shonin lo, niskar v'niskarin lo, shmamina. Good. So ultimately, again, the Gemara wants to suggest that halacha l'maisa, doesn't this mean a broad application of all of the halachos to the situation of menuda? Not necessarily. Maybe it only applies to certain halacha, namely menuda, as we said before, shona v'shona lo. He could learn. You could have others teach him. Niskar v'niskarin lo. Ultimately, again, he could hire himself out to work for others. Others can work for him. Shmamina. Mitzora ma b'asiyas malacha. What about a mitzora? Right? Is a mitzora permitted to go out and do malacha? So tegu. The Gemara leaves that as a kasha. Is it as a kasha? Avel aser berechitza. An avel is not permitted to wash. Tichsiv v'al tasochi shemen. Pasuk says, do not anoint yourself with oil. Urechitza bechlal sicha. And ultimately, again, washing is included in anointing. So if anointing is aser, washing is aser as well. Menuda ma'al berechitza. What about a menuda? Is a menuda permitted to go ahead and wash? Amar Rav Yosef Tashma, kisha amru asa berechitza, lo amru ela kol gufo. When they said that you can't wash, they only said the entire body. Aval panav yadav v'raglov mutter, but one could wash their hands, their face, and their feet. V'china tamotzi b'menuda u'ba'avel. So I will say, so too you find the same thing by menuda and by avel. Once again, my love akulu is not applying all of the halachos to menuda and tavel. Lo ashara mitzora mal berechitza is what is a mitzora permitted by rechitza? Teku. Ultimately, and I both say this is a question that stands. So again, I'll point out also. I'm running out of time, but I know. But halacha l'maisa the isur rechitza by an avel ultimately again is rechitzas kol gufa, washing the entire body. But for example, rechitzas panav yadav v'raglav, washing one's hands, face, and feet, ultimately is mutter, even with hot water. Again, the contemporary halachos of avelos by rechitza is interesting because clearly bathing or hygienic standards have also changed over time. Discussion for a different time. Aval asr b'neilas sandal. An aval is not permitted to wear shoes. Since HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Yecheskel, keep your shoes on. You could infer from this that for everyone else, wearing shoes is going to be asr. For every other avel, Menuda mal b'nei asandal. What about a menuda? Amar Rabbi Yosef Tashma, Kisha amru asr b'neilas sandal, lo amru ella be'ir. Aval b'derech mutter, when Chazal said ultimately again that you're not allowed to wear shoe as a form of mourning, ultimately again by a tiny sibor. So the Gemara says, talking about tiny sibor, lo amr ella be'ir. They only say that's when you're in the city. Second white line, aval b'derech mutter. But if a person is traveling, it's mutter. Hakate. So what's an example of this? Yatsa l'derech. If a person went out to travel, Noel, he could put on his shoe. Nichnas le'ir choletz. He gets home, or comes into his city, he takes off the shoe. V'china tamotze b'menuda uba avel. And you find the same thing ultimately again by a menuda and by avel. My lava kulhu. Does this not come to equate all of these halachos together? Lo ashara. Rather, not necessarily referring to this one, rather could just be referring to the other halachos mentioned in conjunction with menuda and avel. Good. Mitzora mal b'nei sasanda. What about a mitzora? Is a mitzora permitted to go ahead and wear a shoe? Teku. Avel asr b'tashmish shamita. An avel is prohibited from engaging in marital relations. T'chsiv vayinochim David es Bathsheba ishto vayavoy leha. Says David consoled his wife Bathsheba. This is after the loss of their baby, and he had relations with her. Mechlal de meikara aser, which sounds like during their actual avelos they were aser to be together. So from here we see that an avel is not permitted to engage in marital relations. So the Gemara says, menuda ma'u b'tash mishamita. What about a menuda? Amar Rav Yosef Tashma, kol osan shamsha yisava midbar menudin hayu v'shim shumito, saying all the years that Klal Yisrael were in the desert after the chet hamaraklim, after the sin of the spies, ultimately, again, they were considered to be in a state of excommunication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and yet what? They were still permitted in marital intimacy. Abai says, 1 second, maybe being excommunicated to heaven is a more lenient form of excommunication than being excommunicated by a court. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, kill va'amrit chamir. Abai, you just advanced the exact opposite argument on Amud Aleph, where you said being excommunicated by the heavens is more machmir than being excommunicated by a court. So what's going on? Sapuki misapkile. Abai was unsure. Therefore, zil hacha kamatchile, v'zil hacha kamatchile. Essentially, Abai will just simply reject any comparison from nidui l'shamayim to nidui bidei adam. Which one is more machmir, which one is more kal, we're not sure. But at the end of the day, Abai rejects any attempt to try to link them together. Mitzora, ma'u b'tash b'shamita. What about a mitzora? Is a mitzora permitted in marital relations? Tashma d'sanya v'yashav michutz li'ohalo. The pasuk says he shall sit outside of his tent. He shall sit outside of his tent. So the Gemara says, she kemenuda uke avel va'aser b'tashmish shamita. She should be like a menuda, like an avel, and aser in marital intimacy. Ve'ein ohalo elisha. Also, we had this Gemara already. And ohel refers to his wife. Shene emar lech emor lohem shuvu lachem li ohalechem. Tell them back after Matan Torah. Tell them to go back to their tents, which is a reference to resuming or resumption of normal marital intimacy. Shmamina. Ultimately, see from here that a mitzora is aser b'tashmish shamita. Now, remember again, we already clarified this halacha. This refers to a mitzora during the 7 days of his purification. During the days of his tumah, he's permitted in marital relations. I have a nifshot nami lemenuda, so why not learn out from mitzora to menuda that a mitzora is asr b'tash b'shamita, a menuda should be asr as well. Amar Rafun Rav Pinchas Mishay Rav Yosef mi katani sha'asr shei kimnuda ka'avel b'mile achronaisa ba'asr nami b'tash b'shamita. To which the Gemara says, does it say that ultimately, again, it should be aser like a menuda and like an ava? It says, when it says like a menuda, like an ava, it means b'mili achronaisa. Ultimately, again, with other things, v'aser nami b'tash mishamita. It should be aser b'tash mishamita as well. But say, I'll just begin this next part, and then Emir Tashem will continue it tomorrow. Avel eno mishaleach karbanosov. An avel is not permitted to go out and send his karbanos to the Beis Hamikdash. So I will say, this is, I feel very privileged to say over this line, as I'm just literally, Baruch Hashem, a few steps away from the Harabayas. But literally, Aval eno mishlech karbanos. But Aval is not permitted to go ahead and send his karbanos. The Sanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer Shlomim, Bizman Shu Shalim, Velo Bizman Shu Onein. Ultimately, again, in upward pasuk calls, right? We know that a shlomim is called a shlomim. Shlomim from lashon, we normally say it's for lashon shalom, because the beauty of a shlomim is everyone gets a piece. Right? Chash Baruch Hu gets a piece, the kohanim get a piece, the owners get a piece. But the Gemara darshans over here that a shlom from lashon shalim. A person has to be in a state of completion, velo bizman shu onein, and not when he is in a state of aninus. All right, so we'll stop over here for today. We'll Emir Hashem pick up with this. We'll start from Avel Eno Mishnah Karbanos Emir Hashem tomorrow. Shkach, I'm sorry about the technology. Technology glitches seem to follow me wherever I go. I've come to see, this is a good musar for me. I always thought, I always tell Maishi and Jeremy, how can we have a better setup? And I realized the problem is not on the technology. The problem is clearly with me. All right, I have a lot of cheshbon nefesh Emir Hashem to do. Hopefully I'll get it right by tomorrow. Wishing everyone a wonderful, wonderful day. Shkach, everyone. Looking forward to playing with everybody tomorrow. Have a great day.